Great, I'll kick off. My name is Jeff Reichard. I work on the product strategy team in the office of the CTO at Veeam. And I do a lot of what Dave and Rick will tell you about that they do. Basically, a lot of talking with customers and a lot of talking with analysts. And we'll dig into more of what we're hearing from our public sector customers in particular in today's talk.
Brilliant. I feel like, Rick, we could say what, just answer for ourselves what Jeff said, but I'll add on to it. So I also am in the same group. I look after specifically enterprise strategy, but don't let that fool you. We're very concerned about all segments, as we find a lot of the challenges, Rick, really translate across the different areas.
Yeah, indeed, for sure, Dave. And what I do on my role is really kind of embrace the spirit of technical evangelism through the product strategy team, and really all these different disciplines that Jeff, Dave, and I bring here. Chances are we've got a good crowd here today. So anything you guys bring up, just drop it in the chat, ladies and gents, and we'll Dave and I will sort it out for sure.
Sounds perfect. So let's go ahead and kick things off. And I will share my screen and hope that that works correctly. It did at the beginning of our talk today. Can everyone see that?
Confirming you are good to go, Jeff.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump in, folks. The title of today's talk is Public Sector Data Management Trends, Threats, and Opportunities. And what we're going to be reviewing is a little bit of what Dave and Rick and I are hearing from our public sector and education customers in particular around what they're expecting in these three areas going through the rest of 2021 and into 2022. We're also going to dig into what Veeam has learned in a little bit of detail in the data protection trends report that we just released for this year. And I'm going to talk more about that, but this is a teaser. This is an ad for Dave's session at Veeam On, which starts tomorrow, where you'll be able to learn a lot more about that industry-leading research into data protection. So let's move forward. When we talk with our public sector and education customers about what they're expecting through the remainder of this year and in 2022, we hear about a couple of trends. The first, obviously, is budget. Now, if you've been following the news about state and local and education budgets, in mid to late last year, there was a lot of sort of gloomy thoughts. That's looking a little bit better now based on all of the aid from the federal government that's come down, but it's still a concern for every customer in the sector that we talk to. Related to that is, of course, the ongoing pandemic response and the ongoing disruption that that pandemic response is causing. And again, we'll talk a lot more about that. Remote student services, remote citizen services, and the slow transition from basically 100% remote work back to some blend of on-prem and remote work for our workers, for our staff. When we talk about threats, one threat that has not gone away despite the pandemic is the threat of cyber risks and also the increased governance that our state and local and education customers are facing. You guys probably are aware that a couple of more states have added privacy regulations, exactly like California added a couple of years ago. So we now have multiple states rolling out their own privacy regulations that affect public sector and education as much as they affect the commercial sector, and that's something. And the threat of ransomware is an ongoing concern as well. And finally, when we talk about opportunities, one theme that we hear from both analysts and from our customers again and again is that in order to cope with increasing citizen demands, increasing demands from students, and with the realities of trying to educate and serve citizens in a pandemic, remote services, IT transformation, digital transformation are something that's gone higher on everyone's priority list. And we're going to dig into that in a lot more detail too. That's mostly where we'll be looking at the data protection trends report information that I'll be presenting today. So let's dig into the first two trends. And those, again, are ongoing budget concerns and what we're going to be seeing around remote citizen services, remote work, and remote education. In August of last year, the New York Times published a story that predicted a $550 billion budget shortfall through 2022 based on COVID disruptions to things like fees, sales taxes, property taxes that couldn't be collected, that sort of thing. Based on the stimulus that we've seen come down from the federal government and based on some municipalities, some states not suffering as much as had been predicted last year, that number has come down. The Wall Street Journal published a story in March saying that now the best guess estimations were that the ongoing hit was going to be around $300 billion over 2020, 2021, and 2022. But 300 billion is still a big hit. And as everyone on this call knows better than I do, state and local governments don't have the option of running a deficit. So that 300 billion hit represents cuts that you have to make, and in many cases have already made, to citizen services, to education, to staff in a lot of cases, to the projects that you're taking on. So it's an ongoing concern that folks are going to be having. And we'd like to go today to the first poll that we're going to ask about, and specifically to find out what your experience has been around budget issues and operational impacts from the COVID pandemic.
So as Jeff mentioned, folks, we have a poll here for people to participate in. So please, please, please click away. How much have COVID-19 impacts and unplanned expenditures forced cuts in services or delays to existing plans? Strong effect, moderate effect, light effect, or no impact? Please participate in the poll so you can get an understanding as to what your peers are up to and experiencing. We'll let this run for another 5 seconds or so. That's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Some last minute votes in there. There we go. And let's share that. You should be able to see that there, Jeff.
Yep, I can see that if everyone else can. So
Yes.
it looks like the sort of revised forecast that I mentioned just a minute ago is held in your cases as well, that while folks might have thought that there was going to be a pretty devastating effect, it's been moderate or light for the majority of folks, and only 25% have had a really powerful one. This is something that I know Rick and Dave and I are going to be interested in exploring more in the roundtables that we have after today's talk. So I'm really looking forward to finding out a little bit more, particularly about how your data management challenges have been affected by budget and other operational changes. So let's go forward. Thank you very much for sharing that information. The next trend that we're going to talk about is the trend to remote work and remote citizen services. And it's a huge topic. There are a lot of things that we could talk about: the rollout of RDP for remote administration of your environment, the rollout of other ways of remote access or other remote services. But for purposes of being concise and just focusing on the low-hanging fruit, we're going to talk today about one platform, and that's the enormous rollout of Microsoft Office 365 and Teams for collaboration that we've seen in the past year. I expect a lot of you saw the quote from Satya Nadella. He said this when Microsoft announced their Q1 results last April, that basically in the April timeframe, we had seen 2 years of digital transformation in the space of 2 months. The momentum around Teams adoption and Office 365 and Microsoft 365 adoption hasn't slowed. Not going to read all the stats here, but one thing that they point to is the rollout of Teams in particular for a lot of services that maybe folks hadn't been thinking about Teams for before. We now see school districts that are rolling out Teams as the all-in-one education platform for content sharing, for interaction between students and one another, and students and teachers and staff. And so there are platforms like Teams that are being adopted for that kind of use case, where maybe before they were adopted at a much smaller scale, just sort of within the organization for staff communicating, collaborating. And it's had a huge effect. We've seen a big rollout. Fast Company reported last year that Microsoft saw a 50% increase in 6 months alone in Teams adoption, which, if you think, it was already a popular platform at that time. So it's really a huge effect that just this one platform has had. It's also a little bit concerning. And the reason that it's concerning is that, and we'll talk about this more in a minute too, we've heard from a lot of customers. I talked with the CIO of a small town, a small city in Illinois last week, who told me that in the space of 2 days, 85% of the staff in his town had to begin working remotely, and he had to find a way to securely support that. And so a lot of folks have rushed to deploy solutions, maybe without looking at all the ramifications that go with the solutions that they've rolled out. Teams, again, I'm just selecting this as one example. Like all cloud service providers, Microsoft has a shared responsibility model that they try to educate customers on. And in fact, to get certified on Microsoft platforms, you've got to show that you understand this. It's no different for AWS. It's no different for Google. This is standard for service providers that are out there. Now, the line is a little bit different if we're talking about Azure VMs versus Microsoft or Office 365. But in every case, there are things that Microsoft is responsible for, And that's always infrastructure. It's always things like physical security, supporting technology. It's always service levels of the actual services that Microsoft is providing, right? So they're responsible for security. They're responsible for keeping things patched, for the mechanics. They're responsible for the regulatory elements that they can be responsible for, and that includes obviously the compliances that they'll list, and there are a lot of them. This is a Microsoft slide, by the way, so this is not intended in any way to be a knock on Microsoft. But what you'll notice here is that across the stack, the customers are responsible for their own data. If you have regulatory requirements, if you have compliance requirements, those are things that you own and that you have to be cognizant of, because Microsoft can't foresee what those might be for every customer that's out there. Again, not in any way intended as a knock on Microsoft. There's a reason that these services are so popular. Microsoft Office 365 is more flexible, it's more scalable, it's a lot more secure than what most of us ever dreamed of having on-prem when we were doing our own email servers, when we were doing our own collaboration or file shares. But at the end of the day, there are still things that we own in our mission to our constituents, to our students, to our customers. I talked with the CIO of a Florida city, a large Florida city last week as well. He said that in Florida, just as one example, they have something called a sunshine law. It relates to public records. If you're a city government or county government or state government in Florida, you have to be ready to respond to Freedom of Information Act requests. And their retention requirements for certain kinds of records span back decades, depending on whether you're talking about elected officials, whether you're talking about procurement contracts, things like that. So those are situations where I might be asked to produce the files or the set of emails that a certain number of elected officials or appointed officials had on a certain date 5 or 8 years ago. And the recycle bin, as Microsoft is very clear on this slide laying out, doesn't cover that kind of requirement. So it's on us to be aware of that. Now, you might ask, okay, that's fine, but how often does this kind of thing really happen? How often do these issues actually come up where folks need to get back to data and the recycle bin isn't good enough? And the answer is it happens all the time, okay? This news story is from March of this year. This was an unhappy administrator who had been terminated from his organization. It was actually a service provider that rolled out Office 365 to other organizations. And in revenge, when he was let go, he deleted 1,200 of the Microsoft Office 365 accounts from his organization. The news article goes on to say, and the link is in the slide, that they spent months trying to recover the data and ultimately never did recover all of the data that this rogue admin deleted. This individual went to jail for 2 years for what they did. This is one story of more than of a fair number like this that we've seen. There was a story of a large accounting firm last year where an admin with all good intentions actually accidentally deleted the internal Teams chats of over 50,000 users from his organization. And they didn't get all of those back at the time either. So yes, these things happen. Malware, ransomware can also target OneDrive. We actually, in the last 2 Veeam on Veeam customer conferences, have demoed that, the ability to encrypt with a script mapped OneDrive data from a user's desktop. Maybe someone accidentally clicked on a link and started bad things happening. So that's something to be concerned about. And again, not to harp on the point too much, but when I talked with that CIO from a Florida city last week, the other 2 CIOs who were on the conversation said, oh yeah, Illinois has the exact same thing. California has the exact same thing. They all have to be responsive to Freedom of Information Act requests. They all have to be responsive to mandates that they retain data for differing periods of time and be able to restore that data in a really granular, different ways. Focus today is not on product, the focus is on education, but I will point out that Veeam is one of a number of vendors in the space that has a really good solution. We actually have the leading solution in terms of adoption, close to 6 million users actively protecting their Office 365 environments at this point, a lot more downloads than that. The nice thing, and what you should look for to make this a little bit more generalized and educational and sort of not product focused, if you're thinking about a requirement like this, if you're thinking, wow, I hadn't considered long-term retention or the ability to be responsive to Freedom of Information Act requests or e-discovery requests, think about being able to protect both on-prem and in the cloud Office 365 data. Think about the ability to get your data back out of the cloud on-prem. I've had multiple customers who have told me that Veeam's solution in this space basically de-risked their adoption of a cloud migration and let their leadership in particular know we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. If we do this migration, we can still get the data out, we can still comply, we can still pass audits and do what we need to do. You also want the ability to restore in a granular way, and that's where a mature tool like Veeam's backup for Office 365 is really good. If you look on the right in this diagram, it shows all the many different ways that you can restore data that you back up, either from on-prem Exchange or SharePoint or Office 365 services, and get them back where you need them, when you need them. So again, not a big focus on product, but this is something to be aware of. This kind of capability is something that you definitely want to be aware of. So let's move on from trends and talk about threats. And no surprise, there's a lot of threats that are facing our public sector customers. This is the first look we'll have into Veeam's data protection trends report. This is a very big report, and Dave, whom you saw at the start of today's talk, is one of the two folks on the CTO team. The others, our colleague Jason Buffington, who are really responsible for putting this together and rolling out this survey. This is the largest survey ever done by anyone, including large analyst firms, of worldwide data protection trends. What's concerning people? What are they doing around protecting their data? And this is in particular 1,800 respondents worldwide gave responses to what's worrying them. Last year, if you notice, and the last year number is the lighter of these numbers, the light green number, the biggest concern that we had listed was actually the number 5 concern this year, and that was cyber threats. This year it's dropped. It is still in the top 5. We have basically a 3-way tie for second, third, and fourth here. But it also isn't going to surprise you, based on the budget conversation that we had before, that economic uncertainty has come to the top. And this, by the way, holds for public sector and for enterprise and small, medium-sized businesses that we gave this survey to. Economic uncertainty in the wake of what we've all lived through last year and are continuing to live through is a big concern that folks are continuing to address. So around cybersecurity, though, returning to that focus, we'd like to transition now to the second poll question. Ransomware and other threats are in the news a lot. We'd love to hear from you what your biggest concerns are around cybersecurity right now.
Okay, audience, here we go. We're back to another poll. So as Jeff was just mentioning, question is, what is your biggest cybersecurity concern? Ransomware, insider threats, malware, vulnerability, or incident response? I'll leave this up for another 10 seconds starting from now. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And a last second addition there. Thank you very much. And here are your results, sir.
So not really surprised to see this, and I bet Rick and Dave aren't either, that ransomware comes in topping the list. It's interesting, though, it looks like we didn't do badly when we put the poll question together, because all of these, and again, this is what we hear from customers, all these are concerns. What other kinds of malware am I liable to be affected by? Do I have to deal with insider threats like the one that we talked about a couple of slides ago? And what is my incident response? Is it up to snuff? Am I going to actually be able to respond the way I need to when any of these things happen? So thank you very much. We'll move on to the next slide now. Probably not going to be a giant shock to anyone on this call. Local government and education are the hardest hit sector in North America by ransomware. The sector, I'll share a little bit of good news, does not have the distinction of being the sector that has paid the biggest ransom. That record was set last week by an insurance company in the United States that actually paid a $40 million ransom when their systems got locked out in March. Bloomberg broke that story last week. So they have the unfortunate distinction of having paid the most to unlock their files, but we've all seen the headlines. We're completely aware of what's happened to numerous cities, both across the United States and across Canada, that have been hit by this. There are some serious issues that obviously attend to this. The average downtime in one survey that state and local governments face and education customers face is 9.6 days. That's 9.6 days that we're not educating our students, that we're not providing services, that we're not collecting fees and collecting taxes, thus affecting the budget. There's some other stats out there we don't have time to go into, but we can deal with it in Q&A if you like, that talk about some of the knock-on effects of experiencing a cybersecurity incident like a ransomware attack, like your cyber insurance rates going up astronomically. There was a city in Canada, in Ontario, that had a cyber attack back in October of last year that took them a while to recover from. And their experience was that their overall insurance rates doubled this year when they could finally get a new insurance policies written. And that, by the way, is their overall, not just their cyber policy, but their overall insurance rates. That money has to come from somewhere. So it affects teaching students, it affects parks, it affects other citizen services, right? So it's always something that we've got to think about. It's also harder, news story that came out today, for a lot of cities or even states to issue bonds or get loans at the same terms they used to if they're perceived as a security risk. So this is very real, both in its immediate impact and in the long-term effects that it can have. Fortunately, there are some good recommendations that industry experts have around this. And on our team, Rick is probably the thought leader around this. He's done a lot of work on ransomware, but one of the things that we at Veeam like to talk with our customers about it and have done for years is the 3-2-1 rule. You should have 3 copies of your data, including the production copy. It should be on 2 different types of media, and please get one of those offsite. We kind of add to that at Veeam. We make it sort of a backup zip code with a 1 and a 0 on the end. The 1 stands for offline, immutable, or air-gapped. You should have another copy, or at least one of those copies, that isn't sitting online ready to be affected if an adversary is on your network for 2 months and manages to get some of your admin credentials, which increasingly in ransomware attacks is exactly what happens. The bad guy moves laterally, manages to escalate privileges, and one of the first things that they look for is backups, because they know if you don't have any backups to fail back to revert to, you're more likely to pay some number up to $40 million in a ransomware payment. The 0 references the ability to make sure that you've actually done your homework about recovery. And if you are hit with an attack, you know how long it's going to take you to recover. You can recover with no errors, and you can recover without actually restoring corrupted data or infected data back into your production environment, which has happened to customers as well. Again, there's a lot of different options. These are the Veeam options around that second one, the immutable, offline, or air-gapped copy of your data that you really, really want to have. There's old school, there's tape, there are solutions like offline disks that you rotate. Obviously the tapes you want to remove from your library, but a tape offline can't be attacked by an adversary. There's also things like having a service provider who has a different admin context than your on-prem administrative context. And we've had numerous customers who have actually been saved just because they had a service provider managing their backups. And even though all of their admin credentials got hacked, the service provider admin credentials didn't get hacked, so the backups were safe. And of course, we have some very good solutions, both internal to Veeam and with storage partners of Veeam's around data that's immutable at the storage level or data that's made immutable using some features within Veeam. Again, not going to dig into product a whole lot today, but be aware, whoever you're using for your data protection, this is really, really the kind of capability that you want to make sure you've got available. Now, one of the things when I talk about adversaries staying on the network for months at a time at times, obviously a backup solution isn't the only thing that you want. You want defense in depth. And it helps to have a framework to make that sort of thing possible. The one that Veeam has internally adopted, the one that we use, is from an American agency, part of the Department of Commerce, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. This is the Nist cybersecurity framework model. It's very helpful, and it's been widely adopted, and it's pushed by the US government, both for civilian agencies and for companies and other entities, state government, local government, in the United States, and it sees a lot of adoption worldwide because it's easy to explain and to understand to leadership, right? It doesn't focus at the outset on big exhaustive sets of controls. It focuses on a set of completely intuitive processes that you can follow in an iterative way to manage risk. And those are: identify what you have. What do I have on my network? protect it, right? Make sure that I've got solutions in place to protect my network and the assets on the network. If a bad guy gets in, if an adversary gets in there, detect it, and then respond to the threat, respond to the attack, and recover. And again, it's a wheel. It goes around and around, because the idea is I focus on what my biggest risk is, I mitigate that, and I go on down the chain. Okay, this has had wide adoption. I mentioned we've adopted it at Veeam. We've also designed a lot of our product features around working with the cybersecurity framework. Not going to focus on this, but be aware, whatever you're using around data protection, around data management, you should ask yourself, it's not just one thing. It's not just taking a backup. It's not even taking a backup and making sure that I've got it somewhere safe. Defense in depth is real, and having a framework for response is a real requirement. So look at the tools you've got and ask, okay, what can they help me with beyond the main thing that I think about them doing? We think we do a pretty good job of that here at Veeam, but whatever you're using, be aware of it and look at it. Now, the last topic we're going to talk about is opportunities going into 2022. And this is where we're going to dig a little bit more into that data protection trends report. When we surveyed at this point 1,800 IT and executive decision makers worldwide and asked them, what's the reality in your data center now? What did you think it was going to be? And what do you think it's going to be 2 years from now? This slide's a little complicated, so I'll explain it. The 4 pairs of bars are 2 responses. The leftmost, and then the one 2 in from it, the really super bright green one, represents when we asked the question last year, if you look at this, where are you in terms of physical servers in your data center? And if you look, there's 38% had them on-prem. And we asked, okay, 2 years from now, and that's the really bright acid green bar, where do you think you'll be? And the answer was, we think we'll be at 29%. Well, the 2021 response is interesting. Notice they got there a year quicker. Now we ask the question, and they're already at 29% of physical servers on premises that their workloads are running on, and they think in 2 years they'll be down to 24%. Virtual machines, basically, they thought they would be staying flat at 30%. In fact, they've dropped their virtual machines that are on-prem and expect for it to be pretty stable or maybe even go up a little bit. No surprise, on the right is where the big increase is. If you look, what we're dealing with on the right is that folks thought that 32% of their workloads this year would be in the cloud. And in fact, they are estimating that in 2022, that next year it would be 41%. This year, if you look at the second bar, it's actually 47% already. And the estimate now is that we will cross 50% of workloads. So we're interested in what your experience has been, and we're going to go to our final poll question today. Love to hear from you what your organization's response has been around digital transformation and IT transformation. How fast is this cloud journey going for you?
Thank you very much. Final poll of the session here, folks. How would you describe your organization's progress towards achieving DX initiatives and goals? Not started, planning stage, just beginning, in process, or mature? And once again, we'll let this go for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Fantastic. Thank you all for participating. And there are your results, Jeff.
Fantastic. Okay, so this is not really shocking based on the data that we've just talked about, right? There are the imperative to move to different ways of reaching our students, of reaching our citizens, of letting our staff be productive means that maybe faster than we'd anticipated, we've gotten to digital transformation and to moving workloads into places that they didn't used to be. So again, thank you very much for sharing all this information. Not really surprising based on what we've heard from other customers. So this is great. And let's go back now and look at a little bit more about what Veeam's heard from our customers. And this is specifically around, okay, this is the way your workloads are changing. Why would you change the way you're protecting those workloads? And what's interesting when we ask that question, we tend to hear kind of the same things year after year. And that is, well, we want to decrease our costs. We want to reduce complexity. We want to increase our capabilities. And more, and if you look, you can sort of put the responses into these 4 buckets. We need something that lets us actually protect or take advantage of or move data to or move data from the workloads that we have in the cloud. So this is something, we're in the backup business. So we ask our customers and we focus a lot on what they tell us. What would make you change what you're doing so that we know we're guided by the areas that our customers want to move to? And obviously this plays directly into the hybrid cloud result that we just saw. Protecting data to the cloud, protecting data in and from the cloud is a big focus. Now, not going to talk a lot about product. In fact, not going to talk any more about product today, but I will share with you, if you're interested in learning more about Veeam, we are a 100% software-driven solution. We scale from the smallest environments to the largest. We have a huge footprint in state and local government and education in North America and in fact worldwide. Our biggest customer for our Office 365 backup product is a major university in Finland that has close to 40,000 users they're protecting with that. I won't read the numbers or stats, but we're a pretty mature company. We have a long track record of doing this. We've been validated a lot by our customers. We've also been validated a fair bit by industry analysts. We've been in the leaders quadrant of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for several years now. So very strong solution in that area. And analysts think that we're headed in the right direction too. If you would like to learn more, I will just share with you, your timing is perfect because our largest user conference of the year is happening tomorrow and Wednesday for our North American customers. And my colleagues, Dave and Rick, will be two of the main speakers. They've both got multiple sessions. I also have a session with 3 city CIOs that'll be on the second day of it. So if you'd like to learn more about Veeam, there is not a better place or time than our Veeam On conference. And please join us there if you haven't already signed up for it or if you weren't aware of it. And that's all we had to present today. So I will make a quick transition and stop sharing the slides. And I will let Jason share any questions that we might have had from the audience today.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd love to welcome Dave and Rick to also join us on screen here so we can tackle these. Thank you very much. Excellent comments and collaboration going on in the chat feature here, folks. So thank you very much, Rick and Dave, for facilitating whilst Jeff was doing his thing. And thank you again, audience, for getting involved. That's what we really love to see. Love to see it. So without further ado, let's jump into some questions here. I do want to just tackle a question that was answered on through text. And Dave, perhaps you can kind of take this as you took the time to answer. But question came in. What should you include in the data classification and management policy? Do you need it before you start your data management program?
Yeah, I'll tee up my response, Jason. I'd love to hear first Jeff and then Rick's thoughts on this. So I replied to Tong that, that's a great question. I typically advise an organization decide on a fairly simple or streamlined classification framework, meaning simple enough to actually get it adopted. We've all heard about programs that are so heavyweight, they really don't get off the ground. You wait for Nirvana and you wait a long time. And part of the thought around that is gain experience to see what might be appropriate for your organization, your particular requirements. So Jeff, you could think of that as a bit of a pilot project. I've seen though some people, use it in anger, meaning in production, so that, they learn more about the problem that they're trying to tackle. My fear is always if you wait too long, you wait a long time, but I don't know if you have different thoughts.
Yeah, that's to tie it, Dave, that's exactly where I would go with this. When I mentioned the Nist cybersecurity framework earlier on, I mentioned the idea that one of the huge and very deliberate design tenets of that framework is that it's meant to be iterative. Identify your greatest area of risk, iterate the process for that, then go on to the next one. What you don't want to do is exactly what Dave mentioned and what I bet Dave and Rick and I over the course of our careers have all seen multiple times, which is a giant project to classify every single byte of data in the organization that dies on the vine after wasting a lot of money and never yields any benefit. So it's better to get something done than to get nothing done. And that's sort of a premise of the cybersecurity framework too. What about you, Rick?
Well, I would just recommend, consistent with that, a different angle. And anytime you do something new, not necessarily different, but a new process, like we are going to plan DR, or we're going to plan advanced ransomware recovery, or whatever, I would recommend starting with something small rather than the most complicated nook and cranny of your IT practice, because get a good, confident win on the process and then expand it to the other things. So just consistent with that, applied a little bit differently for sure.
Thank you very much, Paul. There's a question here that came in about ransomware. Sylvia is asking, ransomware has the biggest monetary implication, though. And I'm keen to ask you if there's anything you can tell us about cyber insurance coverage for ransomware events. It does come up time and time again, so I'd love to get the opinion of the panel here on insurance for ransomware events as well.
Sure, I'll jump in on that. This is a topic that we are hearing increasingly about. If your municipality, and if you're on the IT decision maker side or the IT professional side, and you haven't heard about this from leadership, if you ask from your financial leadership, you will hear. It used to be 10 years ago and even 5 years ago, it was a new field of insurance, and there was basically a land rush. Companies were writing policies without thinking a whole lot about what was going on, and they just wanted to grab market share. I had a conversation with a broker. I'm having a follow-up conversation with the same cyber insurance broker with my manager, our CTO, on Wednesday of this week. And what they've told us is that what's happening to cities and states and enterprise customers now is that when your renewal time comes up, you're getting handed a bill that is 30% or more higher than last year's bill with less coverage, and they're handing you an audit that some third party has done of your public-facing websites and web presence that shows all of your security vulnerabilities, and a grade that you've been given based on that to justify the fact that your insurance is going up 30 or 40% with less coverage. This happens to folks all the time. And so if anyone takes anything away from this, work with your broker or ask your financial leadership about this, because having a solution in place like the immutability solutions that I talked about before can save your city, can save your state, your agency, your school board a lot of money on insurance if you can show we won't have to pay a ransom, we have a good solution in place.
Jeff, I'll add one little bit to that. And, Sylvia, incredible shares of what you're sharing here. I can't type it fast enough as well, because related to this, I'd say that the framework, that Nist cybersecurity framework, our recommendation is to really apply that across the practice. Now at Veeam, we sit real squarely in the backup world. And you caught me, Sylvia, when you're like, well, data recovery doesn't help me when the problem's out there. And that's true. I'll be the first to admit that, but I don't want to ever give any false sense of security that being able to recover data, that's where something like a backup product would sit well, and Veeam can help. But I would challenge that other security practices, network analytics, should walk that wheel too, and determine, why is there a lot of data going out, being sent out of the organization, abnormal of policy, right? I would press that framework across everything, and every user training and things like that, all the way across the board. This model is good, but I can't help, at least at Veeam, right? We can't help there. One thing I do mention, and this is kind of sideways over to Michael's question, which we'll still process Michael's question, but I actually recommend encrypting the backups every step of the way. That's a new thing I started recommending, because I don't want the backup to be the exfiltrated piece of data, because that's the home run ball, right? It's everything in there. So a little piece of advice there, but no, great transparency there, Sylvia.
Yeah, and maybe we hit Michael's question, which was, can data encryption help with lack of being able to train every user on data protection? I personally would say yes, and for the reasons that Rick mentioned, and double down on what Rick also mentioned, that Veeam per se isn't a security company, but even before I joined Veeam, when I was an industry analyst, when I ran an infrastructure and operations conference, I would tell everyone in the I&O teams, hey, most of us are probably not security people. We all still have a role to play in security. And now I think what I've learned, Jeff, since then, thanks to Veeam's Chief Information Security Officer, is it doesn't matter if you're in the data center or not. And it's because the greatest threat oftentimes is people clicking on a phishing email that lurks and then opens up an avenue for exfiltration. So really, no matter what our role, it doesn't matter if you're the person working in the delivery dock, if you have an account on the system, you still play a role.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Great questions. I'm so happy to see all of the interaction in chat. This is great folks.
Yes.
One other sideways bit on that. I'll double it down another way. I'd argue from at least ransomware and these types of threats, user training, a non-technical thing, right? Investing in training awareness and doing everything else we're supposed to do. Those are likely going to be the most effective specimens to mitigate this risk. Throwing tools on it to monitor and all that, they all work in the premise that something bad has already happened. So you have to work backwards in the supply chain. So I can't underestimate or underemphasize the value of things like training.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, we're starting to round up towards the end of the session here. There's another question. I actually wanted to give you a bit of a platform. This is a great question to do. So to talk a little bit more about Microsoft and 365, for example. Sylvia does say, Microsoft keeps pushing users to their highest license, which is not cheap. Are there any good alternatives? Can you just talk a little bit more about Office 365 in general?
Well, I can start with this one. Our CTO, Sylvia, likes to say that the cloud is not a charity. And that would apply to the software as a service marketplace. And then a couple other of you who have shared comments of, well, it's really frustrating. You go from one platform to the other. I'm a Zoom guy. Some days I'm a Teams guy, or, then Amazon Chime comes in the mix. What's this thing, right? There's all these different platforms, right? My advice to you is the economics of it are hard, right? But what I do think you should be very mindful of across the board is really seeking what I call a cloud economic model or cloud economic intelligence. And we have that conversation a lot in the hyperscale clouds like AWS, Azure, Google. But I also encourage you to take that for serious consideration in the software as a service collaboration space. So if you look at M365, the weirdest thing is that there are so many different ways to consume it. It's very difficult to find your way. And it's kind of like a commercial here in the US. You watch a car commercial, it says MSRP right here, as shown, it's very big, right? And I think that M365, and to be fair, the other services as well can do that. And I think I'll cite some experience I had in my professional experience before I joined Veeam. I worked at it's kind of ironic, but I worked at an organization that was not a very, let's just call it high IT budget type of organization. But the weirdest thing was we did everything so efficient and right. So my advice to you is to really press and ask questions and, explore all the packaging options and explore all the users options, and then go so far as to not necessarily have the same offering for every user. That's another thing. I mean, there was a time in my IT career where I worked at a multi-billion-dollar company and not everybody had email. Believe it or not, I've seen that happen in my organization and it worked. Okay. So you don't necessarily have to give all services to all people. That's another thing, right? So you can also look into some allocation and provisioning and continue to push and ask questions. And you don't always have to fall up, and then the last sideways piece of advice is, especially in public sector, whatever we might sit here, do you have a school district, a peer that's in a similar configuration? You can get a referral. Hey, what are you doing? You have another county or city or state or whatever would be a similar within the same similar parameters that you can get a referral, right? Or even maybe people in this call, right? If there are organizations that can give you peer reviews of how to navigate that, those are avenues to kind of pursue. And then I'll twist it a little bit. And if any of you engage with industry analysts, and Dave, maybe you can advise here, but industry analysts do a lot of bid reviews and kind of those types of things, right? That's something that a lot of people don't know that analysts can do. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a good point. I like your overall notion of, get educated and see what makes sense. All things cloud are consumable. It feels like a million ways. We've probably all seen some slide throughout the last couple of years where it's like 1,600,000 possible AWS configuration options if you look at every single permutation. And then what that leads to is, unfortunately, the lowest common denominator template becomes more expensive. And to your point, Rick, perhaps too expensive. Many moons ago, 15, 17 years ago, when I was at IBM, even at IBM, we had two different email platforms. So even though we like to standardize on a singular solution, there are valid reasons not to have a singular approach, not the least of which is if it's just not financially in your best interest.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to a close of the session. And so I'd like to ask the audience to join me in a virtual round of applause for our 3 esteemed speakers. That was fantastic. Some amazing insights there. As I said, some really, really, really good comments coming in the chat feature there, and some great questions coming in as well. And Rick, you've actually teed up the roundtable discussion beautifully by saying that peer-to-peer review, peer-to-peer feedback is so valuable. And that's the session that is going to be coming right after this, folks. So we're going to close this down. We're going to set up for the roundtable, which is going to be taking a deeper dive into this very topic. And we'll be able to actually open up those questions, not just to the panelists, but to your peers, the attendees, so we can get a bit more of a robust discussion going on this very pertinent subject. So once again, thank you very, very much, Jeff, Dave, and Rick. Really appreciate that. That was excellent insights. And thank you all attendees.